and I'll just, yeah, let me share my PowerPoint. Let me just stop sharing and try again. Now it's hopefully
There you go, housekeeping.
Yeah, welcome once again to especially Darren, that takes the time to present and give us an introduction to Daq Studio. Please, some housekeeping rules. Remember to mute yourself. If you have questions during the session, put a queue, and I will try to answer or ask Darren to answer it. And we are recording this meeting. I will post this PowerPoint presentation as well in the meetup, but you can see that we have some other sessions lined up. One in next Tuesday with the Power BI tables as Excel data types, and one with Reed Havens, who will do some visualization magic. And at the end of our session today, please take time to evaluate and fill out the evaluation screen, which I will post in the chat a link to that. So once again, Darren, welcome to the Danish Power BI user group. So glad that you would join us and give you an introduction to the awesome tool that you have built to all Dax developers. So take it away.
Great. Okay, I'll start. So you should see a introduction to Daq Studio slide.
See it?
Sweet. Lovely. So yeah, I've got just a couple of bookmark slides at the front just to set the scene. So I've been around the Microsoft BI stack for quite a while now, since I first started in 1999. So before it was before there was a 2 at the start of the years. I've been a MVP since 2006. I run the local data platform user group here in Melbourne. So I'm based in Melbourne, Australia. It's a chilly autumn evening here, 7:30 at night. So I've just had my tea. So you guys are just heading into to lunchtime soon, and yeah, it's dinner time over here. I've just finished a full day of work, and I'm now hanging out with you guys, and I'm more than happy to do so. It's I really do enjoy sort of working with technology, and you know, the whole BI field is and the speed it's growing at. It's been great to be involved in. So I've been working with sort of extensions around the Microsoft BI platform for a while. If there are any other sort of long-time Microsoft BI people, you might know the BIDS Helper project, which has now been renamed to BI Developer Extensions. It's a set of extensions that fit into the BI design tools. So it used to be Business Intelligence Development Studio, and they renamed it to SQL Server Data Tools. So that's where that fits. And I worked a bit on the Analysis Services Stored Procedure project, which was a multi-dimensional set of extension functions with a few people that you might have heard of, like Chris Webb, and I think Christian Wade was even involved in that at one point, as well as some other people from the product team. But one of my big time sinks recently has been Daq Studio, which we're going to talk about today. I'm happy to share this. I've got a few links and a few other bits and pieces in this deck, so I'm happy to share this with Eric, and he can sort of share it out later, so don't worry about sort of having to write stuff down. So there's a whole bunch of features in Daq Studio, and rather than sort of talk about them abstract, we'll launch into demos in a sec and show you through a bunch of these features. And I'm more than happy if you've got questions to throw them in the chat or whatever, and you know, feel free to ask as we go along. I'm quite happy to stop and explain things, or if I'm going too fast, or if I accidentally drop something without explaining it deeply enough, feel free to just to pull me up and let me know. So yeah, I can probably talk about Daq Studio for a number of hours. So I'm going to focus on a few key things. So I'm happy to jump around if people have got specific questions and want anything more specific answered. But I've got a few high-level things we'll hit as we go through. I try and keep the daqstudio.org website up to date with lists of all the documentation. I always, when I try and add new features, I try and remember to add them to the feature list on there so that there's at least a basic explanation of the functionality and some screenshots. I'm always happy to, if you've got people get issues or have ideas of things that they want changed or added, there's an issues log on the GitHub website. I do have a blog which I post to occasionally. More often than not, recently it's been about Daq Studio, but also just generally about things that interest me in sort of the BI world. And there's a couple of videos. The Mike Carlo at Power BI Tips, we did, Marco Rosso and I did a couple of hours of sessions on Daq Studio in depth with him last year, and the SQL BI guys, Mark and Alberto, have been doing some BI tools, and I know they've got a number of short, sharp videos on different features of Daq Studio, which are quite good way to get started. And I think that's pretty much it for my slides. So in terms of getting started, this is the daqstudio.org website. So this would be the place you start if you've never seen Daq Studio and haven't installed it before. I've got a big green button at the top of the homepage you can use to grab the installer. As you can see, we've got about 10,000 downloads for the current release. We usually get up to about 30,000 downloads for a release. So this was a bit under 2 weeks ago. And there's both an installer. The installer is probably the best way to go because that will register Daq Studio with Excel and with Power BI. But you can also run it portable. So if you're running on a server or somewhere where you're not allowed to install stuff, you can download just this zip file, unzip it, and double click on the Daq Studio and it'll run. You don't get the integration with Power BI Desktop or with the Excel add-in, but you can run and connect to analysis services or Azure analysis services or Power BI XML endpoints. And you can actually connect to running instances of Power BI as well. So there's the feature list is where you can find out. I've got all the different features down the left. And as I said, I try and make sure I add the new ones as we go into this list of features. So that's sort of where we get started. So what I thought we'd do is have a look at Power BI. So I've got a little copy of a New York taxi data set. You might have seen Microsoft has a slightly bigger version of this. And I've got just a little graphic here, which is a picture of New York, so you can get a rough idea of the lay of the land. If we have a look at the tables just quickly, just so you get an idea of the sort of model we're working with. Most of these tables are fairly small, but the trip table contains a record for each trip for, I think, 2016 and 2017. If you can read that down there, that's 120 million rows I'm dealing with in here. So that's reasonably large for a Power BI file, at least for one you're working with on your desktop. I think Microsoft's got ones that sort of about 10 times that size now. When they play with this New York data set, they inflate it a bit. So I've got here this is all in import mode. Power BI, there's a couple of different ways you can connect Daq Studio. So I've got Daq Studio pinned here down on my taskbar. I can launch it on its own. And so when it starts up, you'll get a connection window like this. You can see here I've been playing around with a premium per user XMLA endpoint, so you can paste the URL in for that. And Daq Studio also has the capability of finding running instances with Power BI. So I've got this New York Taxis 2 model open. If I had multiple files open, you would see it'll give you a list of all of the files we found that are running. And we can also find SQL Server data tools. If you're using the integrated workspace, it'll find copies of that. You'll see the little Visual Studio icon next to workspaces that it's found. So I can click connect, and you'll see the list of tables here in the metadata pane matches the list we've got in Power BI. So we're looking at the same model and the same metadata. I can hold down the control key and zoom in on most of the windows in Power BI. It's handy if you're working with a high-res monitor, or in cases like this where you're demonstrating things to people. I've got tooltips over a lot of the pardon me, the metadata. So you can see this is a compatibility mode 1540, and it's using a English US culture. The last updated is a little bit strange for Power BI, because Power BI does a little refresh calculate when you open the file. So I actually opened this Power BI file 57 minutes ago. But if this was another source like Azure Analysis Services or Power BI XMLA endpoints, you would see the actual last refresh time in there. And you can also see which roles are active, because this is desktop. I'm a local admin effectively on this data source. As you hover over each of the tables, you'll get a count of columns and measures. You'll see all of my measures are in the trip table. It's got 120 million rows. And you can see as I go down, there's like, not only does it pop up the, so this is the fair amount. You can see it's a double data type. So it's got decimal data. There's 6,613 distinct values. I'm not sure why we haven't got the min and the max in this data model. And then we've got a top, it does a quick top 10 to show you example data of what's in that field. So I find that quite handy when I'm sort of writing queries and filters. So you might be looking at month name, and I'm using, these are the English abbreviations, so the 3-character abbreviation for the month, so it's April 2017. So sometimes if you're working with someone else's model, or if you've got a lot of columns in your model, you might not remember which, did I use the short abbreviation for the month or the full month name? You can quite quickly hover over and see a quick sample of what's in each column. But that was connecting by starting Daq Studio externally. The other thing that we've had for a year or so now is the external tools ribbon in Power BI. So when you first install Daq Studio, it will ask you if you want to do an all users or a current user install. The recommended approach is to do the all users. So that requires you to do an elevation to run as admin to install, because it installs in your program files. But the advantage of that is that we'll register Daq Studio with your external tools. And then you get Daq Studio button in the ribbon. So when you click that, it immediately launches Daq Studio, and it doesn't prompt you for which file you want to connect to. It always connects you straight back to the file you are editing. So it saves you at least a click. And if you've got multiple files open, you can launch multiple copies of Daq Studio, and each one will be connected back to that same data model. You can see here this is the main editor in the center of the screen, and there's some little help text here telling you to start typing your query. So this is where you would start typing your Dax queries, and we've got text here. So the first part of a Dax query is the word evaluate. So it's sort of like select in a SQL statement. It's sort of the start of your query. I've got a link here to the daqstudio.org website, which runs through a number of examples. The simplest query is to do evaluate, and you can do an evaluate of date, and that will give me all of the rows and all of the columns in the date table. So this has got 2016 data and 2017. So yeah, it's a financial year, so it's July 2016 through to June 2017. You can see down the bottom of the screen there's a little status bar, and that tells us a number of things. So we've got how long the query took, so that ran effectively in less than a second. So it's 0 seconds, 365 rows. The 317, there's a that's my connection ID. So you can it can be handy if you've got a long-running query you want to cancel. You can see the connection. You can see the local host and the port. So this is the embedded version of analysis services that's running behind Power BI. So your data model effectively runs in a little local instance of analysis services. And there's a little copy button here that you can use to copy this information out. So you can paste it into other tools. So you can use that to connect Excel or SQL Server Management Studio or SQL Profiler, all sorts of tools that will connect to analysis services can then connect back to this data engine. So that's sort of the basics of sort of getting started and getting querying. I've been using this, using the run button. It runs this query. By default, Daq Studio will output a grid here that you can see, but you can drop down the output target here, and there's a 6 different targets you can choose from. The grid is usually default, so you can see the results. We've also got timer. Timer's really just a it's one of the first options I added, but it doesn't actually display the results anywhere. It just lets you run the query and time it. So it's useful for performance tunings, particularly if you're testing a query that maybe brings back 1 million records and you don't want to waste time with Daq Studio sitting here trying to render a large result set and taking time and using memory on the local machine. If all you're interested in is just measuring the time it takes to run your query, you can effectively do the output to timer, which lets you time how long it took, but doesn't actually display the results anywhere. Clipboard lets you immediately run it and copies it straight into Clipboard, so you can then paste into another application. So that should, I know it pastes well into Excel as sort of a table of results. You can also output to a file. When you've got the file chosen and you click run, it'll pop up a Windows dialog, and you can choose a number of different type of sort of text-based formats. You can do a comma separated, tab separated, And there's a few options where you can choose a custom format, choose your own delimiter, and whether you want the text quoted or not to try and make it flexible to be able to export data out. We've also got a couple of Excel options. The static Excel output will create an Excel file with the results in it that are it's just almost like using the clipboard copy and paste, but it'll generate the Excel file directly. The linked is an interesting one because it will launch Excel and it opens an ODC, a connection file. And once you've done that, you've got the results, same results that you could see in the output tab. They've appeared here in Excel. The difference between the two static and the linked is that if you have a look at this table, so if right-click on the table and come down here, there's an edit query, and you can actually see it's sent the Dax query to Excel, and that query is now embedded in this workbook, and so is the connection. So because this is Power BI Desktop, this doesn't work all that well because Power BI Desktop will randomize this port number. But if you are connected to Azure Analysis Services or a local analysis services instance on your network or a Power BI XML endpoint, this workbook will now be refreshable outside of Daq Studio. So you could take this Excel sheet, share it with a colleague at work, and they can click refresh, and it actually triggers that Dax query and will bring back a fresh set of data. So that can be an interesting way of sharing a refreshable Excel sheet with people.
Darren, that will require them to have access to the model that you actually query now, right? Yeah.
Yep, because then the user doing the refresh would have to have permission to access that model and would have to have a connection to that data source. Yeah, and it would then query it as if you did send it to a colleague, the colleague would have to have permissions to be able to query that data set. The permissions on that target model would then be enforced. So. Yeah, so then this is sort of great for sort of BI professionals and people that knew Dax and understood how to write Dax queries, but it's tricky to sort of, if you don't know how to write a Dax query and which functions return tables and which don't, it can be sort of a little bit daunting to get started when you've got just a blank screen, even though I've got the help text now. So one option we've introduced recently is the query builder, which you can either start straight from the home page or you can click the button here. Are there any other questions, Eric? Or
not at the moment.
Lovely. I'll keep moving along. So the query builder here gives you more of a drag and drop experience. So it's quite similar to creating a visual in Power BI. So if I wanted to, so we're connected to my New York taxi model. So if I wanted to look at the drop-off, I can start typing in search terms. From there, I can either I can start to hover over to see if these values are what I wanted, or I can drag and drop in here, and I should be able to just do a single. Oh, I've still got my output set as Excel, so I'm going to cancel that and switch back to grid so we can see the results. So that gives us, that's run the query with the drop-off barrow, and it's got a list of the values from the different drop-off barrows, which are areas of New York. So that's just a single column. We could also add the fare, so I can grab like the total fare amount, drag and drop. There are also, as you'll see, there's keyboard shortcuts. If I click on that, it takes you to the keyboard shortcuts. So I can use C. If I type C while I'm on the metadata pane, it'll add it to the column area up the top here. If I use an F, it'll add it as a filter. If I use B, it'll add the column to both areas. So I could look for the year column and type B, and it adds the year as an output column and also adds it as a filter. So I can choose an is filter, which is an equals, and do 2016. And when I run the query now, we've got the year 2016 and the drop off and the total fare. And if I remove that filter and run, we now get more records because we can see the 2016 and 2017 records. We can drag and drop to reorder the columns within there. You will have noticed that it always positions the measures at the end, even though I've got year after it. That's because of the way it's generating the query. So the other thing, other than just dragging and dropping and looking at the results, is you can then click the edit query button down the bottom here, and this will show you the Dax query that's been generated by the tool. And you can see that we're using this summarize columns function. And so hovering over that brings up the parameters for summarize columns, so you can see what this function does. It takes group by columns. Might be a bit small. It takes a set of group by column names. It takes a set of filters, and then it takes a name and expression. And the expression can be anything that produces sort of a numeric or a single result. So often these are in measures, and in this case it's a measure. So that's why the measures always come out at the end, because they're part of this name expression pairs. So if we do a slightly more complicated query, so if I put year back 2016, and if we look at adding another measure like the average distance, I'll delete out that existing query, and you can see this time it's got both the columns here. It's got the year and the drop off, so the columns always come first. You can see the 2016 filter has been injected as a filter statement, and the two measures, the total fare and the average distance, are added into this query. So if I run that, we'll see the output of this query. So you can see both the query that was generated by clicking edit query, and you can run it and see the results. The other interesting thing you'll see in the query builder are the little pencils next to the measures. These let you edit or override the measure expression. So this pops up a little edit window, which is another little Dax editor. And if I wanted to make this twice as large, I could multiply the sum of the fare amount by 2. So you can see this is just doing a simple sum over this column in the trip table, the fare amount column. When I click OK and run, so we will see, so this EWA is currently 8 million and Queens is 93 million. So when I run this, we'll see this doubles to 17 million and 186 million. And when you click Edit Query, you can see that it's done this by including a define block at the top of the query. So when you do a define over, oh, I've just accidentally. Oh, I've dragged and dropped it twice. Let me just get that out. So it includes a define block at the top of the measure. And when you do a define of an existing measure in the cube, this query will use the definition in the define to override what's in your data model. So it hasn't changed anything in my data model. So it's a good way of sort of experimenting. You can test different versions of a model here, different versions of a measure, and different ways of writing the expression to see if they work better or if they're faster or slower, without having to go in and out of your model and change it there. In the latest release, I also added a right-click option where you can duplicate. So now you can without having to override, you can get an instant copy of. I should go back and undo that because I've got a copy of this now, which copied the expression from there. So now you can have your old and your new versions side by side. You'll notice that the total fair copy here doesn't have the formatting applied. So this has a dollar symbol and commas, and this one just has the commas. That's because all Dax results come back unformatted, and it's the job of the client tool to do the formatting. So what Daq Studio actually does is it looks at all of these column headers and it finds, it then takes each of the column headers and scans through the model looking for a measure. So it's found total fair, and it's found that that's got a format string that has dollars in it, and it's applied this format to that column. Whereas total fair copy doesn't match any of the existing measures in there, so it comes back effectively unformatted. We do have the commas in there. That's actually an option. So up in the file menu, there's a whole bunch of options. Can't even actually remember where. So you can search for it. There's this in the results, there's an automatic formatting results. So we attempt to auto format dates using sort of a international standard date format, year, month, day, rather than using a more ambiguous format like the American one. I'm not a big fan of month, day, year as a date format. But this automatic format results has seen that it's a number and has added the 2 decimal places and the commas here to help us see the different results. This should be, I tried pretty hard to make sure Daq Studio respects the local locales. So it should, I haven't actually, I'm sort of being sort of a single language person. English is really the only language that I can read and write. I did a tiny bit of German in high school, but never enough to really get by. But I do try and make sure that I don't hard code any locales in. So my hope is that that you guys would see periods and then a comma as the decimal separator. Because one thing I have got in Daq Studio is this swap delimiters feature as well. So at the moment I'm using the US, or sort of the English standard, where we use commas to separate the different arguments, and the decimal point is used in between numeric values. What swap delimiters does is it does a smart replace. So you can now see this in more of a European style. So if you've got, particularly if you've got measures and things you're copying from Excel or somewhere that uses the locale for separators, you can paste it into Daq Studio and swap the delimiter style back and forwards. And it's smart enough that if you've got something inside a measure name, so this won't run because I don't have a measure with a semicolon in it, but if I click swap delimiters again, you'll notice it changes those, but it doesn't touch anything inside strings or anything inside an object name. So it's smart enough to know that if you've got a comma inside there, it's meant to stay as a comma because it's part of the object reference. And there is actually also an option in Daq Studio to set the default to use semicolons. So all that does is I actually the tabular engine really only understands the US format. So effectively, when you've got that option set, Daq Studio runs the swap delimiters on the code before sending it to the engine, and then sends it using the US formats. But it means you can sort of code in whichever style you feel more comfortable in. Although now Power BI has, I believe, standardized on the US format, so there's you pretty much have to swap back when you're going to paste a measure into Power BI. So I imagine swap delimiters is probably going to get a little bit less use as time goes on.
I can confirm that in the past that has helped me a lot, that feature.
Yep.
So thank you.
And I still see questions on the forums and from people using Excel where you can use that different option. So they'll sometimes paste code, and so I'll come and paste it into Daq Studio and click that to swap the delimiters off so I can run it against the local model.
We did actually have one question that I missed, and that was when you export data.
Yep.
Is there a limit for the max number of rows?
It's pretty much limited to the data engine. There's no limit that Daq Studio applies. The issue you will find is that when you run an evaluate clause, the result needs to be materialized on the whatever data source you're connected to. So if you're connected to Power BI Desktop, my machine here has 16 gig, so I'm limited to Power BI can't use sort of more than 16 gig, probably take a few gig off the operating system.
Yeah.
But it's the amount of memory available to the data source. So in this case, this local host 5293 data engine. So as long as the tabular engine can materialize the result set and send it to Daq Studio, I can then stream it down to a file. So that's the main limiting factor, is that the tabular engine materializes the whole thing in memory, and it materializes it uncompressed. So even though this is like a 1 gig Power BI file, if I tried to query the whole thing, it would expand out to 10 or more gigabytes in memory.
So I won't ask you to try and export your fact table with the trips with the 120 million rows.
Yeah, interesting you should say that, because under advanced there is an export data option.
Yeah.
So you can export to CSV or to a SQL server. And as part of this, I actually use an undocumented function in Dax. It's in the Dax guide. The SQL BI guides have documented, but it uses top-end skip, which lets you grab a series of records at a time. So I grab million row chunks. So I have actually exported this. This is my test case. I exported the trip table. I won't do it now because it takes it over an hour and a half. But it did generate a 12 gig CSV file.
Wow. Cool.
It took it about an hour and a half, and which is roughly, it took about that time processing to get the 120 million records in, I think, in the first place. So, so yeah, the export data can do it, but that's because it generates its own series of top-end skip queries in a loop.
Okay.
So
cool.
Daq Studio was only using, I think, a couple of 100 meg of RAM, which is typically what you'll see. So yeah, but it's using only 140 meg at the moment. I don't think it got above 200 meg when I was doing the export because it was just doing a million row chunks at a time.
Yeah.
So that's quite a handy thing to do. What are we up to? About 10 past. So one of the main features that I tend to use a fair bit is the this little traces section on the ribbon. So there's currently 3 of them. I'm actually having a look at adding a 4th one at the moment. There's an all queries trace. So what that does is that will capture, that listens to the analysis services engine that you're currently connected to. So in this case, it'll listen to Power BI. If I run the all queries trace, if I went back to Power BI and clicked on a tab that I haven't run before, so it's just generated a table in Power BI. And if we go back here, we'll see it's captured. This is the query that Power BI just ran to get that table of data back. So you can see pickup zone and single passenger ratio measure. And you'll see it's probably easier to run. So the queries that Power BI generates are a little bit more verbose than you might do if you wrote them by hand. But if I run that query, see the all queries trace actually captures that. You'll see it's got the pickup zone and the single passenger ratio. It's got an extra column it didn't display to tell whether the row is the grand total or not. But the other interesting thing about Power BI is it does very heavy caching of stuff. So if I click back on my image and go back to that single passenger table, even though this is regenerated, we won't see a third. We won't see a third in this all queries. So the first one here was when Power BI ran it. The second one was when I ran it from Daq Studio. But even if I click back and forwards off and back, we won't see additional ones because Power BI has actually cached the results of this in sort of a visual level cache. So it's not going back to the engine that Power BI, that Daq Studio is connected to.
So if some of our attendees are actually using the performance viewer in Power BI, performance pane, it's actually the same query that you can copy from that. So you can save that round trip, actually. That's cool.
Yeah, and you can leave the all queries trace running, and as you click across different tabs. But yes, the all queries trace to predate this performance analyzer. But this copy query will give us the identical query. In fact, it's formatted too, I think.
Christian is asking whether you are sharing this model after the meeting, but I guess the data set is one of Microsoft's as well, right? So
no, it's actually
it's
actually a I downloaded CSV files from the New York Taxi. I don't know, the governing body of New York Taxis publishes this data. They originally had some, I think they've got latitudes and longitudes, but they publish a data set that just has the boroughs. So this is all public data.
Yeah.
I probably could make a link to it because it's a reasonably large file. It's 1.3 gig.
I found it here, so I'll put a link in the chat if it's the same.
Yeah, I've used it at a few presentations because it gives me something a little bit chunky to be able to record timings and things again. So the other thing worth noticing is that these two other traces, the query plan and server timings, they're currently disabled. The reason for that is that presently this current window that we're looking at has a single trace. This trace listens to events that are published by the Power BI engine, or we subscribe. We say, tell us when you see a query end event, which is what it's captured here, the query end and the duration. So it took 163 milliseconds to run that last query. All queries doesn't have any filters on it. It just captures all queries from any data source. So if you connected Excel, so if I ran that, open that Excel file up, we'd see that Excel query kicking off here. So any client will get captured here. Whereas these two queries, they put an explicit filter on, so they only listen to queries being executed from this one window. So from the current window. So if I turn on server timings, you can turn both of these on at the same time. They generate two different tabs down the bottom, and you'll see that all queries has a little message up here that it's currently not active. So you can still keep the results here after you've been recording. It's got a little stop icon, and you can see the other two traces next to it are currently running. So server timings captures sort of detailed events from the storage engine, which is one of the two engines inside the tabular engine. So it's got a formula engine, which is this FE, and a storage engine, which is the VertiPack engine, which does a lot of the high-speed scanning. So if I was to run, let's get something a little bit more interesting. I did a webcast with Reed Havens earlier this year, and I showed a measure. I'll just copy and paste it in, and we can talk about it. The other thing I've skipped past is I pasted in a very long line of DAX, and it's a little bit tricky to read. But we have integration with Dax Formatter, and that works both for the main edit window and this one. If I click that, if I click that without highlighting part of the text, it'll work better. So that's now sent that DAX code off to Dax Formatter and got it formatted nicely and come back with a result. So this measure is having a look at the taxi data, and we're sort of speculating what would happen if New York applied a congestion tax. So they tax people more to travel through the city. So if we have a quick look back, if you're curious, Manhattan is the main business district in the city of New York. It's this little portion of the aisle here. So I'm saying, what happens if we had like a 20% congestion tax, and so we raised the fares, taxi fares for people in that traveling in that zone? What would happen to the fare price? So this is doing a SumX over all the trips, and it's checking if the related drop-off location was equal to Manhattan. And if that's the case, it's multiplying by 1.2. And for all the other boroughs, it's just returning the fare amount.
across the 120 million rows table.
Yep, this is not necessarily a good idea. But even then, you can see, like, even with 120 million rows, it still only took 340 milliseconds total. It did do that in parallel, so you can see it ran the CPU time here is a rough indication of how parallel it went. So you can see it was running nearly 10 threads in parallel of the storage engine, because it spent 10 times longer in the storage engine CPU. So this is nearly entirely storage engine bound. We can see there's 6 milliseconds in the formula engine and 334 in the storage engine. So it spent a lot of time just doing a big parallel scan over the storage engine, because the way I wrote my measure was to loop over the big 120 million row table. And so the SumX is an iterator. It will have gone over there 120 million times. It will have evaluated this related 120 million times, and then just done the multiplication. So the rest of it should be fairly fast because it's already summing up the fair amounts for the 120 million. But yeah, doing this related is kind of expensive and not really a good idea. But we can see now that this is an independent measurement. This 340 milliseconds is coming from the storage engine itself. So the tabular engine told us how long the server took to process this query. So there's no Daq Studio time in here. This came straight from the Power BI engine. A better way to write this would be to, instead of going over 120 million, would be to use the drop-off location. And you can see Daq Studio has relatively good IntelliSense. I don't currently have support for variables, which is a shame. So I've been talking to Daniel Ottiger about that, because I know he's in the new Tabular Editor 3. He's got some quite amazing IntelliSense stuff. So we might look at what we can do to help out Daq Studio a little bit with that, because I'm a fair bit behind Daniel in terms of IntelliSense now. But still, all of the core, apart from variables, all of the core IntelliSense should work. So instead of looping over 120 million, I can loop over the boroughs. And if we have a quick look at that, you can see there are 7 distinct values in that column. So then, in fact, I've got this on my other screen. So if I no, that's only grabbed half of it. So I'm doing a SumX of values. So it's also got bracket highlighting, so I can check where the start and the end brackets are, because yes, I can see I'm missing a bracket.
One more, yeah.
So you can see that it's got the red squiggle telling me it's got an unexpected symbol at the bottom there. Yep, and by clicking on the brackets, I can see the matching bracket is down there. So now if I format, we should get a nicer thing. So I'm just looping over 7 different values. I'm storing the total amount just in this total fare underscore total fare variable. And then I'm just checking in if the current furrow as we loop through each of those 7 is Manhattan, then I'm doing the same multiplication as before, otherwise I'm returning the value. So if you remember from before, it took 340 milliseconds. Oh, I think something's still running. Let's cancel that. This is for some reason it's gone into telling me it's disabled because the query is not running. Okay, I'm going to. For some reason, it's got the, it thinks the query is running, but it's not. If I open a new window, so you can have multiple tabs open. Yeah, there we go. So clicking between a different tab and back has forced this, forced the ribbon to refresh itself. Yeah, I need to find I have seen that happen once or twice. I don't quite know how to trigger it yet, so it's quite hard to fix. So if anyone happens to go, this is the sequence for making this button get stuck disabled, I'd love to hear it. Because once I can reproduce an issue, I can usually fix it. But that has now cleared itself up, so we should be able to. No, that is really strange.
I've seen it before, and typically I've just copied the query and then closed Daq Studio and restarted it.
Yeah, I haven't seen it.
But I will keep an eye out of how I actually made it.
Of course, it'll only happen while I'm doing a demo. I haven't seen it get that stuck before. So I want to turn the server timings back on. So yeah, while you disable it, while you switch on server timings, you'll see these buttons will disable for a split second. It can take significantly longer connected to Azure analysis services. For some reason, that can sometimes take a minute or two to enable the trace properly. But when locally, it's really fast. So yeah, now it's running. So if we zoom that in, we can now see that this is 68 milliseconds compared to the 340 on there. So we're 5 times faster at least. So you can use the server timings to definitively measure different variations of a measure or of a query, and see how much faster, and if you're making it faster. And we can see both the storage engine and the total CPU have both gone down with this new approach. So you have a way of being able to measure it without having to run a massive query.
Yeah. And we are almost out of time, Darren. And
yep.
I know that, we have only touched the surface. And
yeah,
there are a lot of other advanced stuff that people can benefit from. So perhaps we could schedule a session part 2, perhaps, if people are interested. But that,
yeah, because there's plenty
you
of
have the time.
BirdiePack analyzer stuff we can look at, and parameters, and loading performance data. There's a number of other things we could investigate.
Yeah, and the Vertipack, the VPACs export, and the metrics. There are a lot of good stuffs.
Yep, there's a lot of good stuff in there, and the benchmarking, and there's a lot of there's a few videos and things out on some of those things as well if people can't wait. But yeah, I'd be happy to do a part 2 Daq Studio in depth. Because yes, we really haven't the advanced ribbon at all.
On the, sorry, what?
We haven't really touched much on the advanced ribbon other than sort of mentioning that export data. So
yeah. But I promised people that we only took an hour out of their lunch and an hour out of your evening.
Yep.
But if people have questions, nobody have raised their hands. People are asking for a part 2. I would please ask you also to fill out the evaluation. I put in a link to the form. And if you have a question now, please raise your hand and we'll stay in the meeting a couple of minutes. But who's asking to join? Nobody here. Who's raising the hand? It's Marat. Can you unmute and ask your question?
Yes. Hi.
Hi.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
We hear you.
Yeah. Great. Yes. Great. Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot, Darren. My question is actually about the coming part 2 probably, but I had a question about the Vertipack analyzer. Initially, when it was Power Pivot version with Excel, it was quite difficult, and when it became the Vertipack analyzer inside Daq Studio, it has become much easier. But one thing that I really miss there is the security roles. You used to have an overview of security roles when it was in the Excel, but now when it's part of that one, it suddenly disappeared. Why is that?
It's mainly I worked pretty closely with Marco on that. In fact, Marco's written a lot of the core code for building the all of the metrics behind the Vertipack analyzer. So he's actually got that in his own library that we both contribute on. And yeah, for Daq Studio, we sort of picked a slightly simpler version of the more common features.
Yeah, I actually did have a conversation about this with Alberto, because I was asking Alberto about if he knew, and then he didn't even remember that it was there at one point. And then I found the version in 1.93, you had security roles, and then when it became in Dax, it disappeared. But but Alberto, he was just like surprised and like, oh, it was ages ago, so old version.
Yeah.
But yeah, maybe it's just on the feature request list, but I think it would be nice to have the overview of security roles.
Yeah, because it would come from the. So I did see someone asking about data management.
Thank you.
Which is where most of the Vertipack analyzer stuff comes from. So yeah, it wouldn't be hard to look at maybe adding that, because yeah. But yes, DMVs was another tab we didn't even really touch on.
Yeah.
No,
yes. Cool. Thank you so much.
Yep.
You're welcome. Okay, let's round it up then, and once again, Darren, thank you for taking the time of your evening to present.
Yeah.
And I'll come back to you and see if we can ask you to do a session part 2 in the near future, if that's okay for you.
Yep, that'd be great.
And to the rest of you, please fill out the evaluation and again, thank you. I can see Kamal has raised his hand. Yep. Do you want to unmute and ask a question, Kamal?
Hi, Darren, Eric.
Hi.
Hi, a very useful session. definitely I'll be going to use it. I haven't used this before, so this will be my first time experiment into Daq Studio. Just a very quick question onto this line. I know that there was a couple of examples you have demonstrated into this session. I'm fairly new to the Dax at this moment, but I've been using Power BI for a number of years. And instead of writing Dax, we were using lots of hard work into the SQL Server to utilize functionality there, and then simply bringing the tables and database views and other side of it to avoid using the Dax. But now, if we wanted to become a little bit more efficient and perfection using the Dax rather than SQL in databases, is there any other useful place you could suggest us where we can have a bit more understanding and learn Dax faster? And also, the second part of question is can we write all formulas and everything into Daq Studio rather than creating measures in the Power BI model?
So no, I typically use Daq Studio now for testing measures. I often build my measures first in Daq Studio, but then I'll end up, especially like with the query builder, you can click new and create a new measure and do a so that would just be a copy of the existing. You could do a sum of the fair amount column. I would then sort of take that and paste it into a measure in Power BI, so I can do sort of my testing and development, make sure it all works, and then paste it back into Power BI, because then you can reference those measures in visuals, whereas you can't reference measures in Daq Studio in a visual and in any of your reports. So I'd say typically I probably do the same. I do a lot of heavy lifting in SQL views, pretty much in SQL stored procedures and views for a lot of our stuff at work, because that's reusable. We can write paginated reports over those views. We can write Power BI models, and it's all constant. So I tend to do a lot of my ETL and transformation, but then I'll tend to write measures to do some of the more complicated aggregations and things over that base data once it's nice and clean and set up in the SQL views. So I'd say it's definitely worth investing in the SQL views.
But it very much depends on
the basic measure of the model. Copy this and simply create a measure. Is that correct? Or is it, for example, what you're just typing is say my measure some trip fair amount. So if we save this, would you automatically save into the model as well? Or is it just purely for Daq Studio?
This is purely in Daq Studio. Yeah, Daq Studio is a read-only tool, so it won't save back. You could use something like Tabular Editor potentially, or you can then copy and paste this expression into a measure in Power BI. Just clicking new measure and well, I pasted the whole query, which won't work.
Yeah, no, that's understandable. Yes.
That sort of workflow.
Sure.
Yeah.
That's great.
Okay.
Definitely one thing to both of you, to well done. It is a brilliant session, and I'm really very much looking forward for the second part too, to learn more about Daq Studio. But meantime, we'll definitely be going to go through with all the on the front page of Daq Studio. There's videos and how to learn more about it. Until then, I'll be experimenting on that, and learning a lot about it.
Good.
Great.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you.
Okay, I will stop the recording and wish you all a very happy day and evening to you, Darren. And thank you again for taking the time.
Thank you. Thanks for attending, everyone.
Bye. Have a nice day.
You too.
Bye.